Good morning. This is Pastor Barbara, aka Preaching with Parrots. Today is August 23rd, 2015. We are going to begin our second in a series of 3 or 4 lessons about the Levirate, I've always pronounced it Levirate, law. We have already a couple of problems. One problem is that last Sunday morning we had difficulty, as I'm having a little difficulty today, recording on YouTube our lesson. So we have a lesson which I have taught but have not recorded yet. My intention is to do that. Something's bugging me. I hear the birds chirping. Something's bothering them. We have terrible weather up here. It's awfully hot. So excuse me, but when your nose itches, you've got to scratch. So I've been told. I've never tried having an itch that I didn't scratch. So we have a lesson that I'm teaching, the second part, for which you may not as yet have heard the first. I will refer to it a little bit so you won't be totally unaware of everything that I explain. We are talking about a time period in history which is neither, and this is rare, it only happens in the book of Genesis. We are neither under the law of Moses, nor are we under the teachings of Jesus and the apostles post the cross of Calvary. Our lesson today and subsequent lessons on this subject have nothing to do with Moses' law. So if you're wondering, well, what did God do to them for that? Or how could they do that and we can't do that? Remember, it was a different time and there were no laws that apply. Those of you, because we do have viewers from outside the United States, those of you who are from the United States have heard us refer from time to time about the law of the Wild West. When our nation was first populated by those other than native-born Americans, it was populated on the eastern coast. So there were cities, there were governments, even though they may be small, and they had laws. But those who first went to the Wild West went where there were no laws governing. And this is sort of the situation in which today's lesson is occurring. I see that we're being featured, so the number of viewers that we have on our live broadcast has just popped up. Welcome to our show for those of you who are watching us from behind the scenes. So we have a couple of problems. Number one, some of you are watching lesson 2 and you haven't seen lesson 1. We'll take care of that as soon as we can. 2, We are talking about some things that you and I find terrible, unforgivable. How could people do such things? How could they get away with it? How come God caused the death of some people? And how come we don't know anything about it? We don't understand it. God didn't tell us. Didn't think we didn't have a right to know, or we didn't need to know. Those are some of the problems we face. Now, as to the lesson, which we don't have on video yet, that I will put on video ASAP, like this evening or tomorrow, are the important things that happened in lesson 1. Let me give you just a couple of minutes of introduction, because without it, we're not going to understand today's lesson. There was a law, and remember, calling it a law at a time when there was no law is kind of unusual. This was before Moses, so of course it was before Moses was given the law on Mount Sinai by God. And much before the teachings of Jesus and his apostles. It was more of a custom than it was a law. Who has authority when there's no law? Your daddy has authority when there is no law. The book of Genesis, in which we hear about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and his 12 sons, the book of Genesis, and the book of Job were written at about the same time. They both tell us of events that happened before the law of Moses. At that time, daddies were in charge. Abraham went out and found a wife. He sent his servant out to find a wife for his son. Sons and daughters everywhere would be up in the air if that's the way things happen now. The same thing happened in the book of Job. You read the first chapters of Job, and you find that Job was out taking care of business for his sons and his family. In lesson number 1, we came to an incident that happened during the time when something known as the Levirate or Levirate law existed. The law had to do with family and family preservation. This law, which was neither given by God and therefore breaking it was a little bit different than when we break God's laws, because we know up front we're dealing with the law of God. This wasn't the case. Very hard for us to understand at a time when not only was there no law, there was no law of God. It was before Moses. In order that family could be preserved, and the ruler of the family was the father, one that sat at the head of the table. The law was that your sons carried on your name and carried on everything that you were about. If a man died and he had no son, He was wiped off the face of the earth. There would never be a record of him having lived. If you were a woman, it didn't make any difference. Women needed men not only to provide for them, but as men and women got older, they needed their sons to provide for them. There wasn't, lay up money, and when you get older, your money will take care of you. Parents looked after their children, but as time went by and parents became aged and elderly and infirm, they needed their children to take care of them. So keep that in mind. The Levirate law said if a man died and didn't have a son, his nearest kin, and your nearest kin, if you're a man, is usually your brother, because you have the same mother, same father, your DNA is going to be very, very similar, even before any of us knew about DNA. And so the Levirate law provided that your nearest kinman would marry your wife biologically, but legally, the male child that would be born would be the legal offspring of the deceased brother. So I'm not going to reteach last week's sermon. I just want you to know that Judah's first son, died. I won't even go into that here. We'll wait till lesson 1 comes out on video. What happened, which is known as Onanism, Onan was his second son, is a matter of lesson 1 that I don't want to revisit at this time. But Onan's second son is killed. So we now have Judah's third son. But he's a youngster. There is no near kinsman who is old enough and mature enough to give Er's wife a son. Keeping that in mind, want to go to chapter 38 of Genesis. Let me check something. Meanwhile, this is how the previous chapter ends. It's actually talking about Israel, or Jacob, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, as our Jewish brothers refer to it. Jacob was also given the name of Israel. So if we say Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, or if we say Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, we're saying the same thing. Israel tore his garments. His family all tried to comfort him. I will die mourning for my son, he would say, and then break down and cry. Meanwhile, and this is why I'm reading the 37th chapter of Genesis. Meanwhile, in Egypt, the traders sold Joseph to Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard. That is what is going on in Egypt. Well, today's lesson is going on. Hi, Bob. You pardon me if I don't chat now. I'll do that as soon as I finish this lesson if you're still here. Make yourself at home. At this same time, you remember Joseph, the story of his coat of many colors. He was, his wife, his father had two wives and two concubines, so he had 4 spouses. His favorite did not have children until the others had been born. And so he loved that son the most. He gave him a coat of many colors, and his brothers were jealous, and they, I think so, probably. But I don't chat when I'm teaching. So, this is going on at the same time that Joseph, the youngest of Jacob's children, is being sold into slavery, and that takes all of Israel into Egypt, where they lived for 400 years. And when they come out, would you take care of this for me, Larry? Okay, let it go. Please don't chat anymore, or Larry will hush you, because it's distracting and I'm also making a video. Now, at the same time that Joseph is being sold into slavery, which means Israel as a nation is going to be translated and go and live into Egypt for a little over 400 years. When they come out, it will be Moses bringing them out. And a year or two after that, we then have the law of Moses. But all of this is before the law of Moses. Now, meanwhile, in Egypt, the traders sold Joseph to Potiphar, the officer of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. Potiphar was captain of the palace guard, the chief executioner. Now we're going to skip several verses because that was last week's law, or last week's lesson. A child was not born to the wife of the first son of Judah. Judah was one of Israel's 12 sons. On Wednesdays, we're studying the Old Testament. And we speak of Israel and the 12 tribes of Israel. Each one of those sons was the head of a tribe of Israel, with a few non-important changes. So he died before she could produce a son. Yesterday, or last Sunday's lesson on Onan, did not produce a son for reasons that when the first video comes out, you will learn. Now we are down to her third opportunity to produce a son. She has got to have a son. People took care of their parents when their parents were too old to take care of themselves. Things were not then as they are now. People needed children in order to exist in their middle and elder years. So Judah his first son died without producing. The Levirate law went into effect. Onan did not cooperate fully with that law. He is now dead. We have one son that's left. He is not old enough to produce a son. So Tamar, who is the wife, is waiting around for him to get a little older. Now, Judah, is taking his time. In the meantime, Tamar is not getting any younger. Her home is now with Judah, the father, one of the 12 sons of Israel. But she doesn't have protection for herself when she's older. He may have other children with other wives. As a matter of fact, we're going to begin today's lesson that way. I'm in verse 10. So far, at chapter 38 of Genesis. So as far as the Lord was concerned, I don't want to back up too far. I get into a video which we have not yet made. As far as the Lord was concerned, it was very wrong of him to deny a child to his deceased brother. That's speaking of Onan. Verse 11. When Judah, the father of the 3 sons, told Tamar, his daughter-in-law, not to marry at that time, but to return to her childhood home and to her parents, and to remain a widow there until his youngest son, Shelah, was old enough to marry her. But he didn't intend for Shelah to do this, for fear God would kill him too, just as he had his 2 brothers. So Tamar went home to her parents. Okay, in English, what does that mean? Judah did not have the right to tell Tamar, go to your dad's home. Under the law, and even before the law, when I say under the law, I'm talking about the law of Moses. If a woman was very young, she could go back home and live with her father and hope to get married again. But remember, marriage was very different in those days. There was a contract made usually with the father of the bride and the groom-to-be. There was, during the wedding ceremony, proof that she was a virgin. Things were very difficult. It was not the same to go back home and live with dad. It was not the same woman who would then be looking for a lifelong companion as a virgin looking for a lifelong companion. And under the, I'm going to use the word custom, because I don't think it's appropriate to use the word law, it was not appropriate for Judah to tell her what to do. It's his responsibility to take care of her until, according to the custom, his 3rd son was old enough. On the other hand, consider what he'd been through. He'd lost 2 sons. We don't know why he lost the first one. We know he lost the second one because the second son did not cooperate with the existing custom in providing a male child for his older brother's spouse. But here we have a man that's lost 2 sons. He's got 1 left. And we can sort of empathize with him if we don't criticize him for not getting on the ball and doing what he was supposed to be doing. On the other hand, we can empathize with Tamar. He's saying, go live with your daddy, really hoping she finds someplace else. But for a non-virgin to get married in those days was very difficult. And remember, the whole idea of her getting married would be to produce children, which in part meant she would be taken care of in her old age. So we have all these people and their individual concerns that we can empathize with. I'm tempted to say the law is the law, but it wasn't the law, was it? It's called the Levirate law or the Levirate law, and yet it's not a law, it's a custom. Whose law is it? It's not God's law yet. It's one which he approved. It's one which, and there are many existing laws that God wrote them into his laws. Just because they were somebody else's laws doesn't mean we can't make them our laws also. So here's what happened. Tamar's wondering, is her father-in-law going to provide her with a husband or not? It looks like he's not. Now, this may throw a curve your way. I realize that people that have read the Bible through once think they have fully understand everything that's in it. But let me tell you, each time you read the Bible with understanding, again and again and again, why do you think we keep reading the Bible into our 80s? Because we find things we didn't find when we read through it in our teens, in our 20s, 30s, etc. Tamar now is wondering, is he trying to push me off on my dad and possibly endanger my existence into my old age? Or is he really waiting for his son to get a little older? So probably Judah thought he was doing what was best for Judah, and now Tamar has to do what she feels is best for Tamar. And what does she feel is best for Tamar? There is no law. Remember, Moses' law has not yet been given. You may find it difficult to accept. There is no law against prostitution. Let me go back and repeat a verse I've already read that will take us now into the rest of our lesson. Verse 11. When Judah told Tamar, his daughter-in-law, not to marry again at that time, but to return to her childhood home and to her parents, and to remain a widow until his youngest son, Shelah, was old enough to marry her. But he didn't really intend for Shelah to do this. Now I'm going to read this in another version in just a minute, because I know some people have problems if it's not King James. He didn't intend for Shelah to do this, for fear God would kill him too, that just as he had his 2 brothers. So Tamar went home to be with her parents. Now let me read this out of King James. Because when we're dealing with other translations, especially an English to English translation that never goes to the original language, just sort of says, well, I think nowadays you would understand it better if I use different words. All right, let me find verse 11 here. Then said Judah to Tamar, his daughter-in-law, remain a widow at thy father's house till Shelah my son be grown. For he said, peradventure he die also, as his brethren did. That this is a translation from the original Hebrew. What I read here was not. This you can count on. He was afraid that he would lose his. How could he lose? How could God take the life of his third son? We don't know why God took the life of his first son. It's not told us. What about the second son? Well, he disobeyed the law / culture / custom. You don't know what the third son is going to do. All of you who are parents of a teenager entering adulthood, you don't know what your kids are going to do. You hope they will do as you have taught them, but once they become adults, and if he goes through with this, he is definitely an adult. Then the decisions are up to them. So Judah is concerned. He's lost 2 sons. Could he lose a third? And Tamar went and dwelt in her father's house. Verse 12, and in the process of time, the daughter of Shelah, Judah's wife, died. Now, we have found, and I won't go into it now because it would take longer, but we find that Isaac was so pleased with the wife his father chose for him that when his mother dies, the Bible says he was comforted by the love of his wife. Well, this is a little bit different. Judah wanted some comforting. Now remember, we have no law against it. Judah was comforted and went up to his sheep shearers to Timnah, he and a friend. The friend's name was Hira and a Julamite. Now, he's going up where he normally takes his sheep to be sheared. Verse 13. And it was told Tamar, she's at home with Daddy, not really sure what's going to happen to her, but a little concerned that maybe her father-in-law is not going to come through. And someone tells her, behold, thy father-in-law goeth up to Timnah to shear his sheep. And she put her widow's garments off from her. Certain garments indicate certain things. You may see sometimes if a police officer has been killed in the line of duty, you'll see other police officers, they'll wear a black band. That's part of their clothing, but it says, we are in mourning. When I was a youngster and someone died at your house, especially during the Second World War, there were things that you put on the outside of your house indicating if your house was in mourning. Widows wore certain clothing, meaning do not approach her. She's not available. She was a widow of and she was wearing widow's clothing. She was not approachable by a man. Her clothing indicated, do not approach me. Don't ask me for a date. I'm not available. I'm a widow. I'm still grieving the death of my husband. I'm going to go back now to the newer translation. Realizing by now she was not going to be permitted to marry Shelah, the third son, though he was fully grown, she laid aside her widow's clothing and covered herself with a veil to disguise herself. Veils can be used for more than one purpose. It can be a matter of modesty. Give me just a second. I am taking my texts only during the broadcast because I do have a close friend seriously ill. So excuse me for that. Now, she puts on a veil. She takes off her widow's garments, meaning I am approachable. She veils her face, meaning you don't know who I am. She wore a veil to disguise herself and sat beside the road at the entrance of the village of Enaim, which is on the way to Timnah. She had heard he's going to Timnah. So she sits at the side of the road. Now, there may be some references to a temple prostitute. Okay, I'm having trouble. Give me just a second. Well, they'll understand. They know. I'll get in touch with them a little bit later. I'm sorry to get my personal business trying to do two things at once, but they're both very important. I don't want to stop this program and start it again, and I can't leave these people that need me at this time either. So she changes her appearance. Her clothing doesn't say, I'm a widow. Her clothing says, I'm available. Her veil says, you don't know who I am. She has heard he's going to a certain town. She sits at the side of the road where anybody going to the town he's going to has to pass. She knows he needs comfort. With a veil to disguise herself on the way to Timnah, Judah noticed her as he went by and thought she was a prostitute since her face was veiled. Boy, I could preach a whole sermon on prostitutes with veiled faces as people who are not people, objects. But that's for another sermon. So he stopped and propositioned her to sleep with him, not realizing, of course, that it was his daughter-in-law. How much will you pay me, she asked. I will send you a young goat from my flocks, he promised. What pledge will you give me so I can be sure you will send it? I mean, you want services? How do I know you will pay for them? Your identification seal and your walking stick, she said. So he gave them to her, and she let him come and sleep with her. And she became pregnant as a result. Now let's get this from King James. So I want to start reading in verse 15. When Judah saw her, he thought her to be a harlot, because she had covered her face. And he turned unto her by the way and said, Go to, I pray thee, let me come in unto thee. For he knew not that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, What wilt thou give me, that thou mayest come in unto me? And he said, I will send thee a kid, a young goat, from the flock. And, not being credit cards, she said, What will you give me? And he says, A kid from the flock. And she said, Will you give me a pledge? How do I know you'll send it? And he said, What pledge will I give you? And she said, Your signet and your bracelets and your staff that's in your hand. And he gave it to her. And came in unto her, and she conceived by him. So that ended right there. There was just a, thank you, ma'am. He's on his way. And she arose and went away, laid by her veil, took off her veil. No need to, now, for people not to know who she was. She was just, for that short moment, disguised. Now, let's go to verse 20. Judah said to his friend Hira, the Adullamite, to take the young goat back to her. Gets the goat, says the friend that was with her, okay, take it to the harlot. But after that, she resumed wearing her widow's clothing as usual. Judah asked, so he asked around the men of the city, this prostitute sits out there. What do you mean? There's no prostitute that sits out here. We don't have a regular prostitute that this is where she conducts her business. Where does the prostitute live who was soliciting beside the road at the entrance of the village? You've never seen a prostitute here, they replied. So he returned to Judah, told him he couldn't find her anywhere. And what the men of the palace told him, then let her keep them, Judah said. We tried our best. We'd be the laughing stock of the town to go back again. I'm not going to have people make fun of us. Now, if she's not there, they figure she's not there in her regular spot. How are we supposed to find her? We're not going to go around asking everybody in town where she lives. Of course, it was just for her a one-time thing. 3 months later, she begins to show. Word reached Judah that Tamar, his daughter-in-law, was pregnant. How does a widow get pregnant? How does anybody get pregnant? So his first thought is, she's been a prostitute. Now, our feelings about things change from time to time. Prostitutes, for years in the United States, have been looked down upon. Hey, at a time when men who visit prostitutes are not looked down upon. Fortunately for us women, God does not see us as second-class citizens. That a law that is good for one is good for the other. Here's a man who has visited a prostitute, and he's now upset with his daughter-in-law because she obviously has not kept herself for his son, whom he was not willing to provide for her. Bring her out. Burn her. Burn her? For being a partner in what he had just done? But as they were taking her out to kill her, she sent this message to her father-in-law. The man who owns the identification seal and walking stick is the father of my child. Do you recognize them? Let me read verse 24 in the King James. It came to pass about 3 months later, it was told to Judah, saying, Tamar, thy daughter-in-law, hath played the harlot, and also, behold, she is with child by whoredom. And Judah said, bring her forth, and let her be burnt. When she was brought forth, she sent her father-in-law, saying, by the man whose these are, am I with child? And she said, discern, I pray thee. Look them over. Whose are these? The signet, the bracelets, the staff? And Judah acknowledged them and said, about the woman he was willing to light the match for, she hath been more righteous than I, because that I gave her not to Shelah, my son. She's a better person than me. I didn't give her my son. That was his responsibility. And he knew her again no more. And it came to pass in the time of her travail that, behold, twins were in her womb. And it came to pass, as she was in labor. Now let me read now from a more modern version. She is more right than I, because I refused to keep my promise to give her my son Shelah, but he did not marry her. In due season, and remember, this was, parents said who married who. was not the son's doing. This was Judah's doing, the father. But in due season, at time of her delivery, she had twins. And as they were being born, the midwife tied a scarlet thread around the wrists of the child who appeared first. But he drew back his hand. And the other baby was actually born first. I have more experience with birds hatching and dogs and cats giving birth. And sometimes these things, multiple births, happen rather quickly, and you find ways, especially if you have purebred dogs and they are going to have some value, you want to know who's who, and they look exactly alike. You find some way to determine which was first, which was second, and so forth. Sometimes it's done by putting nail polish on a particular paw. Each person has their way of identifying too, but this is the case where one baby put out his hand, and you know what a breech is. And then most deliveries are head first, but in this case, a hand came out, they put a marker on it, the hand went back, and the other baby was born first. A little unusual, but then everything about this story is. The other baby was actually first to be born. Where did you come from? She explained. And ever after that, he was called Perez, meaning bursting out. Then soon afterward, the baby with the scarlet thread on his wrist was born, and he was named Sarah. I'm going to read you the first verse of the 39th chapter, only so that we know where we are in history. I read you the last verse of the 37th chapter. And now let me give you the first verse of the 39th, so we know where we are in history. Joseph arrived in Egypt as a captive of the Ishmaelite traders. Let me comment on that. And I'm going to close this lesson after just a few brief comments. The people Joseph was sold to were Ishmaelites. Who is Ishmael? Ishmael was Abraham's firstborn child by his wife's Egyptian handmaiden servant. Kind of complicated. It explains the feelings between, I don't want to say all Arabs, but some Arabs and our Jewish brothers. We've been talking about firstborn. One of Onan's problems may have been, now when I was a child, I heard it preached and taught that Onan, at the time, he changed his mind. Probably changed his mind because he thought, oh, I'm going to be seeing this little child grow up. He's going to be my baby, and I won't be able to go hug him and give him love because he's actually, in truth, going to be my nephew. But legally, he's going to be, legally, he'll be my nephew. In actuality, he's going to be my son. I don't think that was his thinking. Things were done out of duty and custom more than affection and love. I think that Onan thought, if this male child is born, he will be the firstborn of my father's firstborn. If he were mine legally, he would be the firstborn of my father's secondborn. Meaning the child he was about to co-create would be higher in the family line, both in stature, in the way he was viewed by others, probably eventually in what he would inherit, would all be a part of firstborn, or the firstborn of the firstborn. Now, Ishmael was the firstborn, as the Bible says, of his loins, the first child that Abraham produced was by his wife's mate. Now, legally, it would have been his and Sarah's, not his and the maid's. Why? Because I own my dog, and I therefore own any puppies that my dog has. Sarah was the owner of her servant, and therefore the owner of anything her servant produced. Sorry to say it in such vulgar language, but that's how things were in those days. When Sarah finally, in her old age, produced a son, Isaac, this was the son of promise. This was the mother of the Jewish nation. The Egyptian woman who was the mother of Ishmael was not the mother of the Jewish Hebrew nation, but her son was his firstborn. So the Muslims and the Jews and Christians all have this to deal with. Firstborn versus child of God's promise. That's a whole other thing to be considered also. But I just wanted to let you know at what point in history this happened. This is one of Israel's 12 sons. His name is Judah. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Judah, or Abraham, Isaac, Israel, Judah. Judah is the man who has now become the father. Where does this take us as far as first child, second child? Instead of this man's first son not being the father because he's dead, the second son, Onan, not being the father because he's dead, the third son, Shelah, not being the father because daddy never said, go do your duty. Now, the father. Of her dead husband is now the father of her child. So if we look back at status at that time in history, the man has now two sons, Sheila, teenager or young adult, and these newborn twins. I'm going to end our lesson here. For those that are on the live program, hang on just a minute, I want to close our video. And for those that are watching the video, sorry, it's been kind of an interrupted, but then that's been my life this week. And I could choose to take on certain responsibilities and not do others, but I chose to do as much as I could. And if it's been a little haphazard, thanks for understanding. Until our next video, hopefully before the third one, we'll get the first one. Blessings on you all. Bye-bye.